This is Gene Diag History, and today we are still in the West Eurasian category, but we're not in Europe anymore. And the category and the region that I'm talking about is North Africa. So before we get there, we have to talk about what North Africa is. So obviously, it is a region in the northernmost part of Africa, and it's below the Mediterranean Sea and above the Sahara Desert, which includes the countries Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Those are the main ones, though sometimes it includes Mauritania, Western Sahara, and sometimes Northern Sudan. So, I want to get more into their identity, and the first thing is the deep indigenous foundation of their area, which is the Amazigh/Berber people, as they're the oldest continuous identity associated with North Africa. So major Amazigh populations include the Kabyle, the Rifan, the Tuareg, and the Chahui peoples. When it comes to its anthropological significance, they are indigenous to North Africa. They're genetically tied to very ancient North African populations, but are also connected to Mediterranean and West Eurasian population flows, as it had human continuity for tens of thousands of years. Ancient populations include Ibero-Masurians, Capsian cultures, and Neolithic pastoralists. So, modern North Africa are partially descended from these groups. That's why North Africa is neither simply Arab settlers, not simply sub Saharan Africans, nor simply Mediterranean Europeans, as there's something distinct. Now, I want to talk about North Africa as a Mediterranean region, and it's long been tied to the Mediterranean world, outside of it being right below the Mediterranean. See, historically, it interacted heavily with the Phoenician colonization, the Roman conquest of North Africa, the Arab conquest of the Maghreb, the Ottoman rule, and European colonialism, where cities like Carthage, Alexandria, Fez, and Tunis were, and sometimes still are, major Mediterranean centers. And coastal North Africans often resemble southern Mediterranean populations because of trade, migration, conquest, and intermarriage, which is why they can visually and phenotypically overlap with Southern Europeans, Levantines, Middle Easterns, South Iberians, Sicilians, Maltese, Greeks, and Turks. Now I'm going to move on to the Arabization of North Africa, which happened after the 7th century Islamic expansions that came with the spread of the Arabic language, Islam, the Arab political identity, which reshaped the region profoundly. However, Arabization did not mean total population replacement, as the majority of ancestry remained locally North African, while the language and identity became increasingly Arabized. Many modern quote-unquote Arabs in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya are genetically heavily Amazigh/North African. Egypt is somewhat different because it also has strong continuity with the ancient Nile Valley population, Levantine influences, Mediterranean influences, as well as Arab influences. One thing that I do want to address is that the Sahara is not a wall, as modern people often imagine it as North Africa versus Sub-Saharan Africa as sharply divided. But the Sahara, while difficult to travel, it was permeable. For centuries, there were caravan routes, migration, slavery, trade, and Islamic scholarly networks, in addition to dynastic movements, producing varying levels of sub Saharan African ancestry across North Africa. Generally, the coastal urban areas historically had more Mediterranean/West Asian influence. However, the southern desert regions had stronger Sahelian interaction, so more sub-Saharan African DNA. So, groups like the Tuareg people sit partially between the North African and the Sahelian worlds, where countries like Mauritania, southern Libya, southern Algeria, and Sudan show especially strong blending zones. Egypt is kind of its own civilizational axis compared to the others, and they're partially separated anthropologically from the Maghreb, because Egypt historically centered around the Nile Valley, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Near East. Ancient Egypt interacted intensely with Nubia, the Levant, Greece, Rome, and Arabia, so Egyptians often occupy a somewhat different anthropological position for Western North Africans. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about colonialism and the modern Middle Eastern North Africa or MENA identity. So, European colonial powers, especially France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, helped reshape how North Africa was categorized. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the Europeans often viewed North Africans as Oriental, Arab, or Mediterranean, rather than African in the way that they categorize sub-Saharan Africans. In modern geopolitics, North Africa is usually grouped into MENA, i.e., Middle East and North Africa, where the category emphasizes Islamic and Arabic connections, but can obscure the region's African and Amazigh roots. So, when it comes to the racial ambiguity of Northern Africans, they occupy one of the most racially ambiguous positions globally. Depending on the context, they may be seen as African, Arab, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, brown, white, non white, or other. This changes by country, class, religion, phenotype, diaspora locations, and the political climate. So, for example, in France, Northern Africans are often racialized as non white immigrants. In the United States, many are legally classified as white slash MENA adjacent. In Latin America, some may blend into the broader mestizo or Mediterranean categories. So, I want to briefly touch upon the religion and identity, or the identity in relation to religion. Islam became the dominant framework of identity in North Africa. Today, the overwhelmingly majority are Muslim, but historically, North Africa also contained the indigenous religions Christianity and Judaism, notably the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, so the Coptic Egyptians, historic Jewish communities across the Maghreb. Religion helped connect North Africa to the Middle East, the Sahel, the Ottoman world, and the broader Islamic civilization. Now I'm going to talk about why they and their descendants are grouped together today. So, one of the reasons is geography, and it's very simple. So, the countries stretching from Morocco to Egypt share the Mediterranean coastline, the Sahara Desert, related climate zones, historical trade networks, and long term cultural exchange. Over time, outsiders and locals alike began treating this belt as a connected world, where Romans historically called much of it Africa or Africa Prontosaurus. Arabs later conceptualized much of the western region as the Maghreb, and Europeans eventually grouped it as North Africa. Islam and the Arabic culture and language became major unifying forces in this region, as the biggest cultural glue was Islam and the spread of Arabic. So this happened after the Islamic expansions of the 7th and 8th centuries. As Arabic became dominant across much of the region, Islam became the main religion, and North Africa became tied to a larger Islamic civilization. This created shared legal traditions, literary culture, religious identity, architecture, naming systems, and political networks. Even though these countries, as their own people, have separate identities as well. It's why modern institutions like the Arab League includes North African states. Another simple reason is colonialism, as it standardized the category. So, with Europeans calling and reinforcing the idea of North Africans as a unified force, especially under the French colonialism in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, under Italian colonialism in Libya. With just this happening, they categorize North Africans as Muslim natives, Arabs, Berbers, Orientals as well, rather than as Europeans or Sub Saharan Africans. This had lasting effects on census systems, immigration systems, policing, labor recruitment, and diaspora identities. All inherited these labels. Another element to this is migration, which created the diaspora groupings, especially them migrating to Europe because they migrated through similar channels. For example, Algerians in France, Moroccans in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Tunisians in France, often occupying similar social positions, they're usually seen as working class immigrant communities, Muslim minorities, and post colonial populations. As a result, broader society often flattened distinctions between them, just calling them North African in these areas. Another reason is racialization pushing them together, compressing their complex ethnic histories and identities into these broad categories. So, North Africans are frequently racialized together because they are perceived as Arab, Muslim, brown, immigrant, Middle Eastern adjacent, or Mediterranean outsiders. And this is especially true in Europe and to a lesser extent the United States and Canada, even though there are huge enormous differences amongst North Africans in many ways. Middle East and North Africa, or the MENA, further consolidated the group. So, in the late 20th and 21st centuries, the rise of the MENA category, which is Middle East and North Africa, further grouped North Africans with Southwest Asia and within one another. This happened through geopolitics, oil politics, immigration discourse, Islam related discourse, security policy, and academia. Another is that their descendants inherited the grouping through diaspora identity. So, children and grandchildren of North Africans often inherit the language, religion, food, surnames, family structure, and community networks that link them back to the broader category. As the identity becomes layered, and this broader society, or the broader society, may still categorize them collectively as North African. Another reason is that the grouping exists because of their shared history, but there are still limits. North Africans are grouped together because they generally do share geography, intertwined history, Islamic civilization, colonial experiences, migration patterns, and overlapping ancestry. But there are also major internal differences. And the modern grouping is partly historical reality and partial simplification, so they don't delve into the major historical orientation and the separate identities that these five countries have. And the final reason is anthropology, essentially, as they form a regional population complex or cluster. Anthropologists and geneticists often group North Africans together because they share an overlapping ancestry cluster or clusters, long-term regional interaction, and a common demographic history. But this doesn't mean that they are homogeneous, as North Africans are best understood as a connected regional population with substantial internal diversity rather than a single race or ethnicity. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the timeline of what's now known as North Africans, and we know that this is essentially the story of a crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Sahara, so we're not even going to waste much time. So, the first time period is prehistoric North Africa, so this is before 10,000 BCE. So, North Africa was inhabited very early on in human history, as important prehistoric populations included the Etruscan peoples, the Ibero-Masurians, they're the main ones, and Caspian cultures, where these people adapted to the coastal Mediterranean zones, grasslands, and later desert conditions. So, the desert didn't really exist yet. At various times, the Sahara is not a desert, but a greener savanna-like region with lakes, rivers, wildlife, and pastoralism. Now we're in the Green Sahara era, which is from 10,000 to 3000 BCE, so the Sahara was habitable. During the African human period, the Sahara was dramatically greener. People herded cattle, they fished, they built settlements, and moved across the regions now separated by desert. So, pretty much the rock art showed cattle culture, hunting, social life, and early pastoralism. And it meant that North Africa, the Sahel, and the Nile populations were much closer than they are today. Now we're moving on to the ancient Amazigh/Berber Formation, which is from 3000 to 1000 BCE. So this is during the period that the Sahara was drying up. So as the Sahara dried, populations concentrated along the Mediterranean coasts, Atlas Mountain, Oasis, and the Nile Valley. The distinct Amazigh/Berber cultures emerged across the Maghreb. These groups became the core indigenous populations of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya as they developed tribal confederations, trade systems, pastoral traditions, and regional kingdoms. So now we're essentially in ancient Egypt, pretty much, and now civilization, but pretty much ancient Egypt. So this is from 3100 BCE and onwards. So Egypt developed one of the world's earliest civilizations. Key periods include the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Ancient Egypt was connected to Nubia, the Levant, the Mediterranean, and Inner Africa, as Egypt was never isolated. When it comes to its place in North Africa, Egypt formed a somewhat separate civilizational axis from the Western Maghreb, as it's more Nile centered, more Eastern Mediterranean oriented, and more connected to the Near East, but it remained part of the broader North African world. So now we're at the time where the Phoenicians and the Carthage got more involved. So this is from 1000 to 146 BCE. So seafaring Phoenicians from the Levant established colonies across North Africa, and the most famous was the Carthage, as the Carthage became a major Mediterranean power with wealthy. They are wealthy through trade, and they were influential across North Africa and Iberia, with the Punic world blended Levantine, Amazigh, and Mediterranean influences. And now we're in Roman North Africa, so this is essentially ancient Rome, but the influence in North Africa, or the part that they took over in North Africa. So this is from 146 BCE to 400 CE. So after the Punic Wars, Rome conquered much of North Africa, where North Africa became one of Rome's richest neighborhoods. Regions, my bad. Major cities flourished like the Leptis Magna, Alexandria, and Carthage, like I mentioned before. North Africa supplied Rome with grain, olive oil, soldiers, and intellectuals, where the cultural effects had Romanization spreading Latin, Christianity, urbanization, and Mediterranean culture, but the Amazigh identities persisted beneath the imperial rule. Now we're in the Arab Islamic expansion, so this is from the 600s to the 900s. This was one of the biggest turning points in North African history. Arab Muslim armies expanded westward from Arabia, where the region gradually adopted Islam, Arabic, and Islamic political structures, and this wasn't simply a population replacement. Most North Africans remained largely descended from the earlier local populations, but instead, the language, religion, and elite culture shifted over time. This is where the Arab identity, Islamic civilization became dominant frameworks in North Africa. So now we're in the Islamization and Arabization. So this is from the 1900s to the 1500s. So over the centuries, Arabic spreads deeper, Islamic scholarship expanded, Amazigh and Arab identities are blended in many regions. Major dynasties emerged like the Almoravids, Almohads, and Fatimids. Sorry now if I mispronounce any of those, which I'm pretty sure I did. North Africa became deeply tied to Al Andalus, so this is Islamic Iberia, which is now known as Andalusia in Spain, the broader Muslim world, and trans-Saharan trade. Well, so speaking of the trans-Saharan trade, North Africa became linked economically to West Africa throughout or for gold, salt, enslaved peoples, scholarship, and pilgrimage routes. This intensified interactions between North Africans, Sahelian Africans, Arabs, and Mediterranean people. So now we're in the Ottoman era, which is from the 1500s to the 1800s. So much of North Africa came under the Ottoman Empire influence, especially Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Meanwhile, Morocco remained relatively independent in comparison. The Ottoman era reinforced the Islamic identity, Mediterranean trade, and Turkish cultural influence in some urban areas, or urban elites. Now we're in the European colonial era. So this is from the 1800s to the 1960s. So this era proudly reshaped modern North African, or profoundly, my bad, not necessarily proudly, reshaped modern North African identity. So major colonial powers included France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Spain. And three of those countries being on the southern end really of Europe isn't really surprising as proximity wise it's closer. Anyways, key events included the French conquest of Algeria, the Italian colonization of Libya, and the British occupation of Egypt. Colonialism radicalized North Africans, reorganized economies, imposed European political systems, encouraged migration, and created nationalist movements. The modern North African nationalism largely emerged during this era. So now we're in the independence and Arab nationalism era, which ranged from the 1950s to the 1970s. North African countries gained independence during this period, where Libya did it in 1951, Morocco and Tunisia did it in 1956, and Algeria did it in 1962. This period saw Arab nationalism, socialism, anti colonial politics, and pan Arab movements. So figures like Gamal Abdel Nasser strongly influenced the regional identity. Many governments emphasized Arab identity, sometimes at the expense of the Amazigh recognition. Okay, and this final period is kind of a combination. So it's modern North Africa, but it's also the MSC cultural revival. So I'll say this is from the 1980s to the present, where movements pushed for language rights, cultural recognition, and indigenous identity for MSC people and their culture to be recognized, especially in countries like Morocco and Algeria. This challenged the older idea that North Africa was simply Arab. And when it comes to the broader North Africa, it is currently shaped by globalization, migration, Islam, post-colonial politics, youth culture, diaspora communities, and the region remains internally diverse, which includes Arab, Amazigh, Saharan, Nile Valley, Mediterranean, African, and Islamic identities and groups all overlapping. Modern North Africans may identify as Arab, Amazigh, African, Mediterranean, Muslim, Middle Eastern, or a combination of all of these. So now we are going to get into the average phenotype of North Africans. But before I start that, I'm going to say that there is no single North African look, but there are recurring regional patterns because North Africans share overlapping ancestry shaped by the indigenous Amazigh/Berber roots, Mediterranean mixing, Arabization, and Saharan interaction. So there's varying levels of sub-Saharan African, Levantine, and European influence, in addition to the base of Amazigh Berber. So, when it comes to the broad North African phenotypic range, it can naturally range from very light skinned with light eyes and straight hair to dark brown skinned with tightly curled hair. Both extremes can be fully indigenous to North Africa, which surprises people because modern racial classifications often expect cleaner categories that actually exist historically. So, when it comes to the most common quote unquote core North African look, the most statistically common North African phenotype, especially across Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, northern Libya, and parts of Egypt, would generally be light, when it comes to the skin tone, light brown, olive, beige, and golden brown, or medium Mediterranean complexions. With their hair, it's usually dark brown or black, with wavy to curly hair and sometimes straight hair. When it comes to the eyes, the most common eye color is brown or dark hazel, but lighter eyes like green, gray, honey, and blue are more common than many outsiders expect, especially in some Amazigh heavy regions. When it comes to the facial structure, there are common tendencies as there are where they on average have strong or angular noses, oval or long faces, pronounced brows, medium to sharp facial features, and varied lip thickness. Many North Africans visually overlap with Southern Europeans, Levantines, Maltese, Sicilians, Southern Iberians, and some Middle Eastern populations due to this. So the look of North Africans are so variable because North Africa sits at the intersection of Africa, Europe, the Mediterranean, and Southwest Asia. So as a result of over thousands of years of migrations, invasions, trades, intermarriage, slavery, and imperial movements, their looks and the phenotype essentially includes all of that, which is why North Africans are not a racial isolate, and different regions can be absorbed or absorb the influences mentioned above differently, or the quantity of it is different. Depending on the person, North Africans may visually blend into Southern European populations, Middle Eastern populations, Horn of African populations, Afro Latino populations, Mediterranean Jewish populations, or mixed race categories in the Americas. So North Africans often quote unquote pass into multiple categories. This is why North Africans are often racially ambiguous in diaspora settings. For an example, a Moroccan person in France may be read as Arab, Mediterranean, Latino, mixed, white, or non white, depending on the context and phenotype. So, the final category of this video is North Africa's ties in the hierarchy of whiteness or just race in general. So, North Africans historically complicate European racial categories as they were largely built around Black, African, White European, Asian Oriental as broad categories. North Africans disrupted the boundaries because they, 1. lived in Africa, 2. often spoke Arabic, 3. practiced Islam, 4. could also resemble Southern Europeans or Levantines phenotypically. So, Europeans historically oscillated between seeing North Africans as white but inferior, Semitic/Oriental, African but not black, or racially mixed. This ambiguity became central to colonial racial politics. 2. In colonial Europe, they were usually below Europeans, even when they were classified as quote unquote white. So notice that sometimes they were classified as white. So under colonial rule in France, Italy, and Spain, North Africans were generally treated as culturally backward, non European, Muslim outsiders, and racially subordinate. Even lighter skinned North Africans were rarely treated as socially equivalent to Northern Europeans. This is important. Whiteness was never just about skin tone. It also involved Christianity, European ancestry, civilization narratives, political power, and cultural assimilation. North Africans often failed those tests in Europeans' eyes. A huge factor is Islam, where it became a major marker for non whiteness, so it's a religion, not a race. And there are several non white people who practice Christianity, which is used as a barometer of race somehow. Muslims were historically racialized as foreign, oriental, threatening, uncivilized, or permanently outside the nation. And this affected North Africans heavily because many North African diasporas are visibly associated with Islam. So even a phenotypically light North African could still be racialized as non-white because of name, religion, accent, neighborhood, dress, or ancestry. So North Africans are often seen as an in-between layer, as they are in an intermediate position as not fully accepted as white, but often not categorized the same way as black populations are either. This resembles the historical position of Southern Europeans, Levantines, some Latinos, and Middle Easterners, all of them who have strong ties to whiteness when convenient. This racial status often changes based on their phenotype, class, religion, and proximity to European norms. So, in the United States, North Africans were legally classified as white. So, in the US Census and legal history, many North Africans and Middle Easterners were historically classified as white. Why? Because early US racial laws often defined whiteness broadly enough to include people from the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of the Mediterranean. This was partially tied to court rulings, immigration law, Christianity in some cases, and inconsistent racial logic. Though many North Africans still experience racialization as Arab, Muslim, brown, foreign, or Middle Eastern. So there's often a gap between legal whiteness and social whiteness. So North Africans historically occupied a position somewhat parallel to Southern Italians, Greeks, Maltese, Iberians, and Balkan populations. In Northern European racial hierarchies, Mediterranean people are often seen as darker, less civilized, more emotional, and less purely European. So, due to this, Northern Africans sat even further outside of that hierarchy due to all that I mentioned. Okay, so the relationship with blackness is very complex, as they're not viewed as black really anywhere. However, they are African, i.e., living in the continent of African. Many of them do have sub-Saharan ancestry, and some North Africans are visibly black or dark-skinned. But the complicated histories involve the trans-Saharan slavery, anti-blackness, Afro-Arab identity, Saharan mixing, and Afro-North African communities. So this is mainly in groups like Mauritania, southern Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan, where in many North African societies, lighter skin has historically created higher status, partially due to class, Ottoman influence, Arabization, Mediterranean beauty ideals, and colonialism. Okay, so that concludes my video on North Africans. It was very interesting and fun looking into this group. I'm definitely going to do the West Asians or Middle Eastern people, whatever term you like to use, next, and I cannot wait to get into the other areas of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. So, breaking down these communities in these broader terms leads me to eventually break them down into smaller regions and areas. So it's kind of like a template where I could go more specific or less specific. So that's kind of the framework that I'm working with. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye.